They said my great-grandfather's 80-year-old dam was an eyesore and safety hazard, so they bulldozed it while I was at my daughter's wedding. I came home from autumn's reception to find 80 years of hand-cut limestone blocks reduced to rubble, muddy water rushing wild, and the smell of diesel fumes hanging thick in the evening air. The controlled flow that had protected our neighborhood since 1943, destroyed in 4 hours by a woman who moved here from California 2 years ago. There stood Cordelia Blackthorne on her pristine deck, sipping what looked like champagne, watching raw creek water flood into her own subdivision's storm drains. The HOA notice taped to my mailbox. $12,000 in unpaid infrastructure fees for a dam that existed before her precious neighborhood was even a developer's fever dream. Here's what they don't teach you in HOA president school: water always wins. And I'm a retired Army Corps engineer who's about to give it some very specific directions. What would you do if petty officials destroyed something your family built with their own hands? Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and tell me your worst HOA horror story. My name's Ezekiel Ironwood. The sound of water used to soothe me. That evening, it sounded like laughter, mocking, violent, alive. The creek wasn't just rising, it was remembering. Every stone that my great-grandfather laid by hand had held back the weight of a valley's worth of storms. Now, freed from its walls, that same water clawed through the land like a wounded animal. My boots sank into the soft mud as I walked to what used to be the spillway. Floodlights from a parked bulldozer painted the mess in harsh white. The limestone was shattered. Fish lay gasping in shallow puddles. My old willow tree, roots half exposed, leaned like it was grieving. "Mr. Ironwood?" A voice came from behind me. A deputy, young and unsure. "They said you were notified. HOA clearance order. You can file for reimbursement if you..." I didn't let him finish. I just stared past him, toward Cordelia's deck. Her silhouette stood out against the porch light, calm, untouchable. She raised her glass in what might have been a toast. That's when I felt something in me snap. This wasn't about fees. It wasn't about safety. This was about control. She thought she could make my land fit into her world: neat lawns, soft rules, fake smiles. But this land had belonged to my family before her kind ever laid pavement here. And it remembers us. By the time the deputy left, the sun had vanished behind black clouds. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. Nature's timing is funny like that. As if the earth itself had been waiting for me to come home before it began to rise up. I walked to my truck, opened the glove compartment, and took out the old survey maps, paper yellowed, edges frayed. My grandfather's handwriting covered them in pencil: elevations, flow rates, reinforcement notes. Every inch of that dam had been built to work with the land, not against it. Cordelia's new drains, however, weren't ready for the water that was now running free. And I knew exactly how the next rainfall would travel, where it would pool, where it would break, and whose driveways it would swallow first. The first drops hit my windshield as I started the engine. They destroyed our history. But I was about to remind them what history does when you try to erase it. The rain came slow that night, just enough to turn the dust into slick brown paste. I sat by the window, lights off, listening to it. Every drop that hit the tin roof sounded like a countdown. My wife used to love that sound. She said it made her feel safe. Tonight, it only reminded me how fragile safety really is. The next morning, I went down to the county records office. My name still carried a little weight around there. 32 years working flood control for the Army Corps does that. I didn't smile, didn't explain much. Just asked for the demolition permit. The clerk hesitated before pulling up the file. "Sir, it was marked as an emergency removal under community hazard protocols," she said, her voice tight. "Signed off by the HOA president, and the county inspector." "Which inspector?" I asked. She shifted. Temporary contract worker. Name's not in the system yet." There it was, the first crack. A fake signature on a fake hazard report. Cordelia had greased a few hands, I was sure of it. HOA presidents like her didn't get their hands dirty, they just made sure someone else did the digging. I requested a copy of the inspection report. She printed it hesitantly, pages still warm from the machine. One photo caught my eye, the dam's south retaining wall. A red X sprayed on it like a death mark. But behind it, I noticed something no one else would have, a reflection in the water, faint but distinct. A white SUV. HOA decal on the bumper. Cordelia's car. The timestamp? 6:17 a.m. That dam wasn't declared unsafe, it was targeted. That night, I went back to the site with my flashlight and my grandfather's old field journal. The air smelled of silt and fuel. The water level had dropped a little, just enough to expose the broken base stones. I ran my hand across them, cold, slick, unforgiving. That's when I saw it. The bulldozer's tracks ran straight through my private property line. They hadn't just broken the dam, they'd trespassed. And in this state, that meant liability. Big liability. But I didn't want money. I wanted something they'd remember longer than a court fine. A week later, Cordelia hosted her HOA board meeting, backyard wine, fake laughter, the usual crowd of retirees and suburban aristocrats pretending to be mayors. I parked my truck across the road and watched from the shadows. Her deck lights gleamed against the wet grass. The same deck that overlooked the creek. She was talking loudly about property value preservation when the lights flickered. I smiled. Not because of the storm, but because of the blueprint I was holding, a revised topographical map I'd spent 3 nights perfecting. It detailed every drainage path the HOA had rerouted after they built their modern storm system. I'd helped design the original layout back in the 90s, I knew its veins and arteries better than anyone. They thought tearing down the dam gave them more control over the water. They couldn't have been more wrong. Over the next few days, I began my work quietly. No tools, no heavy machinery. Just stakes, rope, and shovels. I redirected minor runoff channels, subtle adjustments here and there. Nothing illegal. Just natural persuasion. The land had memory. It just needed a reminder of where to flow. By the time the next storm warning came through, the creek had already shifted its loyalty. The water now sought the lowlands, the HOA's perfectly leveled lawns, their underground garages, their ornamental ponds. Cordelia stood outside during the drizzle, arms crossed, still convinced she'd handled the problem. She didn't know she'd just created a new one. And me? I just sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the clouds thicken over the ridge. This time, the water would decide who really owned this land. By Thursday, the storm sirens had begun their low, haunting hum, the kind that crawls under your skin. The forecast called it a once-in-a-decade rainfall. I knew better. The system building over the ridge wasn't just a storm. It was retribution. I sat on my porch, listening to thunder roll across the valley. Every boom sounded like a heartbeat, steady, inevitable. The air was electric, heavy with rain and memory. I'd spent 3 nights walking those creek lines, nudging the land back into its old patterns. The HOA's neat culverts and shiny drainage grids had no idea what was coming. Around dusk, I saw the first flashes of lightning split the sky over Cordelia's neighborhood. Her deck lights flickered once, twice, then went dark. It started with a trickle, the same creek that once flowed like silk beneath the old dam now roared with purpose. I could see the water twisting through the new subdivisions, reclaiming paths it hadn't touched in 80 years. I put on my raincoat, grabbed the flashlight, and headed toward the ridge. The wind screamed through the trees, carrying bits of leaves and grit. By the time I reached the creek, it was no longer a creek. It was a serpent, fast, alive, angry. Downstream, Cordelia's prized lawn was already gone, replaced by a river that cut straight through her white picket fence. Her perfect backyard pond had merged with the floodwaters, turning her gazebo into a lonely island. I stood there, soaked to the bone, watching her struggle with a flashlight, yelling orders at two HOA volunteers who were knee-deep in mud. They were trying to unclog the storm drains with shovels, drains I knew were now useless. The runoff was coming from beneath them. Because that's what happens when you build over what you don't understand. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, disbelief first, then fear. She screamed something I couldn't hear over the roar, but I could read her lips. This wasn't supposed to happen. Oh, but it was. The dam had been more than stone and mortar, it was the valley's balance, the invisible hand that tamed chaos. Destroying it didn't just release water. It released consequence. The storm intensified. I could hear sirens now, volunteer fire department, maybe the county flood team. I used to run those calls. Not tonight. Tonight, I was just another man watching justice flow downhill. One of the HOA men slipped, his shovel swept away in the current. Cordelia reached for him but nearly lost her footing. They stumbled back toward her deck, drenched, helpless. Behind them, the subdivision's elegant stone sign, Blackthorn Meadows, cracked and crumbled as a torrent of brown water surged through its foundation. By midnight, half the streetlights were underwater. Power transformers sparked like angry stars. The creek had become a river, and the river had claimed its old bed, the one Cordelia's developer had paved over years ago. I stood there under the pounding rain, whispering a name I hadn't said in years, my grandfather's. "Looks like your work still holds, old man," I said softly. "The water remembers you." I should have felt guilt. Maybe a part of me did. But when I saw Cordelia standing on her balcony, staring into the dark water that had taken everything she tried to control, I realized, this wasn't revenge. It was restoration. By dawn, the rain eased. The damage was done. Cordelia's perfect neighborhood looked like a ghost town, fences gone, cars half submerged, manicured lawns turned to swamps. I drove down the ridge road, slow and silent. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and diesel. And as I passed the ruined subdivision, I saw it, my dam's foundation, still standing beneath the mud. Unbroken. Nature had rebuilt its truth. And I hadn't lifted a single weapon. Just a memory. And a map. Morning came like a bad dream you couldn't wake up from. The air was thick, the sky pale and bruised. The water had retreated, but it left behind a silence so heavy it made the birds forget to sing. I drove slowly past the subdivision, tires crunching over broken asphalt and branches. The once perfect lawns were seas of brown sludge. The air smelled of wet wood, gasoline, and fear. Cordelia's white SUV was half buried in silt, nose down in what used to be her driveway. A cluster of HOA members stood nearby, wrapped in raincoats, whispering like mourners at a funeral. When my truck passed, their eyes followed me, suspicious, resentful, maybe afraid. One of them, a man in a neon vest, stepped forward. "Mr. Ironwood. They're saying this flood came from your land." I killed the engine and opened the door slowly. "No," I said calmly, "this came from our land. The same land your president tried to beautify." Cordelia appeared from behind the group, mud streaked across her once perfect clothes. Her voice cracked like glass. "You caused this," she shouted. "You manipulated the creek. You let it happen." I looked at her, not with anger, but with something colder, pity. "You bulldozed a dam that stood for 80 years. That dam managed this valley better than your HOA ever could. What you're seeing now is the land taking back what's its." Her jaw trembled. "We had permits. We had." "Fake permits," I interrupted. "Forged signatures. County's already looking into it. You'll find the inspector's name doesn't exist." The color drained from her face. Just then, a county truck pulled up. Out stepped a man in a soaked jacket, Sheriff Langley. We'd served in the Corps together. Zeke, he greeted quietly, then turned to Cordelia. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. There are some questions about your demolition authorization. Her voice rose, panicked. You can't be serious. This man, he's behind all of it. Langley sighed. Ma'am, we checked the timestamps. Your crew breached that dam without legal clearance. You're lucky no one was killed. She tried to speak again, but her words drowned under the sound of flashbulbs, reporters, already there. I turned away and started back toward my truck. Behind me, Cordelia's voice cracked into a plea. You don't understand. It was an eyesore. It was unsafe. Langley answered flatly, it was history. And it was working. As I drove up the hill toward my house, the landscape opened up before me, the valley scarred but alive. The old creek glimmered faintly, reshaped yet familiar. My grandfather's stone foundation still held, like the bones of something ancient refusing to die. I parked near the dam site and got out. The sun was starting to break through, casting long beams across the wet ground. The silence here felt different, calmer, heavier with meaning. I walked to the edge of the remaining wall and crouched down, running my fingers along the limestone. Beneath the silt, I felt the carvings, initials my great-grandfather had etched there in 1943. EI. Same as mine. That night, local news lit up with headlines. HOA president investigated after unauthorized demolition leads to flood. They showed footage of Cordelia being questioned beside her ruined deck. Her voice trembled as she blamed the old infrastructure. They didn't show the rest, her crying when she realized no insurance would cover a self-inflicted disaster. I didn't smile. Not once. This wasn't about gloating. It was about justice finding its own current, slow, patient, unstoppable. The next day, Langley stopped by my porch. Hell of a mess, he said, eyes scanning the horizon. You didn't have anything to do with how it played out, did you? I met his gaze and shrugged. I just let the water go where it wanted. He studied me for a long second, then gave a faint smirk. Guess it wanted to make a point. As his truck rolled away, I watched the sunset paint the sky in bronze and crimson. The kind of colors that only come after a storm. Cordelia's neighborhood would rebuild, maybe. But it would never be the same. The ground beneath it would always shift, reminding them of the balance they broke. And I'd be here, like my grandfather before me, guarding what was left. Because some things, land, legacy, truth, aren't meant to be paved over. Weeks passed. The county drained what they could, but the land never forgot. Every time it rained, puddles formed in the same hollow places, Cordelia's former lawn, the HOA clubhouse, the parking lot where they'd held their wine socials. The earth itself refused to cooperate with their order. Cordelia left quietly. Sold her ruined house for a fraction of its worth. Word was, she moved somewhere far from water. As for me, I rebuilt. Not the old dam, not fully. Just enough to guide the creek where it wanted to flow. My daughter, Autumn, helped me lay the new stones. This feels right, she said, her hands muddy but smiling. It is, I said. This valley was never meant to be controlled. Just understood. We carved the same initials into the cornerstone, EI. Same as my great-grandfather's. Same as mine. That evening, we stood by the water as the sun fell low, golden, quiet, peaceful. The new flow shimmered in the light, soft and steady, just like it used to. Autumn looked out at the horizon. Do you think they'll ever learn? I smiled faintly. Not yet. But the land will remind them. Because water keeps its own record. Every drop knows where it's been, and where it belongs. And when arrogance tries to bury history, the earth finds its way back. Always. The creek whispered against the stones. And for a moment, I could swear I heard my grandfather's voice in the breeze. Water remembers, Ezekiel. It always remembers. I looked out across the valley, toward what was once blackthorn meadows, now wild, untamed, alive again. And I whispered back. So do I.